The courtroom beneath the city was not supposed to exist, and Anastasia Kingsley was not supposed to be standing in it, with a blade of cold iron pressed against her throat. She had found the entrance herself, naturally. 3 weeks of obsessive detective work, 47 photographs, 16 interviews with terrified human informants who spoke in whispers and refused to give their names, and one very long night picking the lock of a false wall behind the wine cellar of a restaurant on Fifth Avenue that no health inspector had ever successfully entered twice. She had found it. She was proud of herself for approximately 4 seconds before 2 vampires in ceremonial black had materialized out of the shadows and dragged her in front of the oldest gathering of predators she had ever seen in her entire career. The secret court of Valdris, the name alone, made normal detectives close their case files and relocate their families. Anastasia Kingsley had written it on a sticky note and circled it 3 times. Now she stood in a chamber carved directly from bedrock beneath Manhattan, its vaulted ceilings lost in darkness, its walls lined with pale stone columns wrapped in ancient script she could not yet read. 40 vampires in formal court attire watched her with cold, luminous eyes. Some were ivory pale and ancient-looking, their white hair elaborately coiled or braided, their expressions carved like old portraits of themselves. Others were younger by vampire standards, perhaps only a century or 2, their features still carrying traces of the century in which they had been turned, their clothing an unnerving mixture of historical and modern. At the far end of the chamber, elevated on a dais of black marble, sat the high seat, and in the high seat sat Theron Lazarescu. He was the most beautiful and terrifying thing she had ever seen, and Anastasia had once interviewed a man who kept live wolves in his apartment. Theron's skin was the white of first snowfall, flawless and luminous in the chamber's torchlight. His hair was silver white and fell past his shoulders in thick waves, swept back from a face that belonged in the portrait gallery of a 16th-century Romanian estate. His eyes, even at this distance, were the deep, dark amber of old cognac, and they were fixed on her with an expression she could not immediately classify. Not rage, not hunger, something more dangerous than either. Calculation. He was dressed in charcoal and deep crimson, a long-fitted coat with high-collar details that somehow managed to look both archaic and devastatingly current, and he wore no crown because he needed none. Power radiated from him like heat from a furnace. She could feel it from 20 feet away. The vampire holding the blade against her throat was named Dorvale. She had learned in the last 40 seconds by listening to the whispered consultation happening just behind her right ear. Dorvale was the court arbiter, the second most powerful vampire in this chamber. He had sharp, fox-like features and pale blonde hair pulled severely back, and he smelled of old coins and older blood. And he was currently presenting Theron Lazarescu with what he called a gift. "A human detective, my Lord Lazarescu," Dorvale announced, his voice carrying beautifully in the acoustics of the carved stone chamber, "who has breached the inner threshold of the Valdris Court, who carries in her coat documentation of our locations, our members, and our feeding arrangements across 7 boroughs." He paused. "Under Blood Law Article 14, the penalty for such an intrusion is immediate dissolution. We ask the Lord's seal." Anastasia kept her breathing even. She had been in worse situations. She was actively trying to remember one, and while she was coming up slightly short on specifics, she was confident the general principle was sound. Every head in the chamber turned to Theron. He had not moved. He sat in the high seat with the absolute stillness of something that had never needed to hurry, one long finger resting against his jaw, his amber eyes traveling from Dorvoil to the blade to Anastasia's face and staying there. "Her name," he said. His voice was low and precisely enunciated, carrying an accent that suggested Eastern European origins filtered through several centuries of deliberate refinement. It was not loud. It did not need to be. "She has no name in this court," Dorvoil said smoothly. "She is the intruder. That is sufficient for a blood law proceeding." "Her name," Theron repeated, and the temperature in the chamber dropped a perceptible degree. Dorvoil smiled thinly. "Anastasia Kingsley, a licensed private investigator. She works cold cases for the city's unsolved database, and apparently, my lord, she has recently developed an interest in our affairs." Theron said quietly, "I know." The chamber stirred, rustling fabric, exchanged glances, the particular silence of a crowd that senses something shifting beneath the surface of an ordinary moment. Dorvoil pressed on, and Anastasia noted clinically that he was very good at pressing on. "Under Blood Law 14, the court's seal is required within the hour or the law defaults to mercy release, which would compromise our security across the entire." "I am aware of the provisions of Blood Law 14, Theron said. "I helped write them." "Then my lord understands the urgency." Anastasia decided this was her moment. She had been cataloguing exits, structural vulnerabilities, the placement of every vampire in the room, and the angle of the blade against her throat since she arrived. And she had also been listening very carefully to Dorvoil's precise legal language, and something about it had snagged in the back of her detective's mind like a thread caught on a nail. "Blood Law 14, she said clearly, and every pale face in the room turned toward her with varying degrees of surprise. "Applies to hostile intrusions committed with intent to expose or destroy. It says so in the amended covenant of 1887, which you all ratified, and which I have a translated copy of in my coat alongside everything else you're so upset about." Dead silence. "I wasn't intruding with intent to destroy," Anastasia continued, keeping her voice steady despite the blade's cold pressure. "I am investigating a murder. 3 humans, found with marks consistent with vampire, feeding on the east side over the past 6 weeks. 2 of them were children." The silence changed quality. It went from stunned to something heavier. Dorvoil's grip on the blade did not waver, but his eyes flickered. "The human makes claims to deflect the human," Theron said, and he rose from the high seat, and the entire court went still the way a forest goes still before a storm, is telling the truth. He descended the dais steps unhurried, because nothing about Theron Lazarescu suggested he had ever needed to rush, and walked the length of the chamber with a kind of contained authority that made the sea of formally dressed immortals part around him like water. He stopped in front of Anastasia at a distance of 3 feet, and she made herself meet his eyes directly, because she had not survived 15 years of detective work by looking at her own shoes. Up close, he was even more extraordinary. The amber eyes had depth to them, layers of intelligence, and something she was going to classify as grief because she recognized it and because it was the most human thing in his face. He was several inches over 6 feet, broad-shouldered, and he smelled of cedar and clean winter air, and something older and deeper underneath, like the smell of very old stone in a very old building. He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. "Remove the blade," he said, not looking at Dorvoil. "My lord, Blood Law 14 does not apply," as she correctly stated. He still did not look away from Anastasia. She entered under investigative purpose with documented cause. The clause is clear. Blood Law 14 requires hostile intent for dissolution to be valid. Investigative intent voids the provision entirely. Dorvale removed the blade. His smile, Anastasia noted, did not reach his eyes. It had never reached his eyes. She still carries our secrets, Dorvale said pleasantly. We could simply take them. You could try, Anastasia said. Something moved in Theron's expression. It was very brief. She catalogued it anyway. Miss Kingsley, he said. You came here about the murders. Yes, then we have something to discuss. He turned and walked back toward the dais, and after a pause that she refused to let feel like hesitation, Anastasia followed him, and 40 pairs of ancient eyes tracked her every step, and she thought, this is either the best lead she had ever followed, or the last one. She was hoping for the former, but she had prepared, as always, for the possibility. Of the latter, the room they moved to was off the main chamber, through a door that looked like a section of wall until Theron touched a specific stone and it swung inward. It was smaller than the courtroom and more personal, furnished with bookshelves rising to the ceiling, a heavy oak desk, 2 chairs, and a fireplace that burned with actual fire. There were maps on one wall and papers on the desk, and a sword mounted over the fireplace that looked like it had been used within living memory, though living memory was a complicated concept here. Theron sat on the edge of the desk rather than behind it, which she noted as a deliberate choice. It put him at eye level with her seated in one of the chairs, equalizing rather than dominating. She filed that away. You've been investigating the Valdris Court for 3 weeks, he said. I've been investigating 3 murders, she said. The court was an intersection. How much do you know? Enough to know that whoever killed those people violated your blood laws, your court protocols, and approximately 6 treaties I found reference to in the Covenant translation. She reached into her coat, slowly, watching his reaction to the movement, and pulled out a folded sheaf of papers. I also know that you've been investigating the same murders internally. I found evidence of it. Your people were at 2 of the 3 crime scenes before the police. His expression did not change, but something in the amber eyes shifted. That is correct. So we're both trying to solve the same case. Yes. Then work with me. The silence stretched. Through the wall, very faintly, she could hear the murmur of the court beyond. Whatever drama had just unfolded in the main chamber was presumably still being processed by 40 immortals with nothing but time and opinions. You understand what you are suggesting, Theron said finally. A human detective with access to the internal workings of a vampire court. The security implications alone would be significant if I were here to expose you, she said. I am here to stop someone from killing children. The implications sort themselves out around that. He studied her with an attention that felt almost physical, and she had the distinct impression he was processing her at several levels simultaneously, reading things in her posture and her heartbeat, and the particular quality of her conviction that she could not fully control. 3 children were the victims, he asked quietly. She paused. 2 of the 3. Yes. The 3rd was a 19-year-old. I said 2 children initially, because the 3rd was barely an adult, and the distinction felt technical. Something in his face closed briefly, like a shutter. The murders were committed by a member of this court. I know, you know, he repeated. The bite pattern on the 3rd victim was distinctive. Unusual fang spacing, wider than the norm, a very specific mark that I've been working to identify for 2 weeks. She met his eyes. I found a match in a portrait from 1803 in a private collection. The subject was a vampire named Vasimir, who, according to what I can piece together, is currently a mid-ranking member of your court." The silence that followed was different from all the previous silences. It was the silence of something confirmed, rather than something revealed. "Vasimir," Theron said. "Yes, he is under court protection. Then court protection is shielding a child killer." He stood from the desk then and moved to the fireplace, and stood looking into the fire for a long moment with his back to her. And she watched the line of his shoulders and the particular tension in the way he held himself and thought. He already knew. He had known or strongly suspected, and whatever was keeping him from acting was not ignorance. "There is a complication," he said. "There always is." He turned. "Vasimir made a petition to the court 18 months ago. Under the old covenants, any court member who formally petitions for trial privilege cannot be taken into custody by the Lord's direct order. The petition must be heard in full session, which requires 7 senior arbiters, a minimum of 90 days' notice, and the physical presence of the petitioner." He paused. Vasimir filed the petition and then disappeared from court appearance. He has not been seen at formal session for 4 months, but the petition stands, and while it stands, my hands are legally bound. Anastasia stared at him. "Someone helped him file that petition specifically to prevent you from acting, yes, Dorvale?" The amber eyes met hers, and she saw the answer. "Not yet." She leaned back in the chair and looked at the ceiling, processing. The architecture of it was elegant in a terrible way. Vasimir had been set up as a protected asset, shielded by a procedural petition that weaponized Theron's own commitment to following his court's laws. Dorvale was arbiter. He controlled the procedural machinery, and Theron, who had written those laws himself centuries ago because he believed in them, was now trapped by them. "The petition," she said. "Let me see the original filing." He looked at her. "Why? Because I am very good at reading documents, and because the same instinct that brought me to the clause in Blood Law 14 is telling me that something in that petition is wrong." She held his gaze. "I have been finding the thing that doesn't fit in documents for 15 years. It is the only supernatural ability I possess. Let me use it." He retrieved the petition from a locked drawer in the desk. It was handwritten on formal court parchment, dense with old script and complex legal language, stamped with 4 different seals. He set it on the desk in front of her, and she bent over it, and he stood at her shoulder close enough that she could feel the particular cool radiance of his presence, and he was quiet while she worked. She read it 3 times, the first time for general comprehension, the second time for structure and form, the third time very slowly, for the thing that didn't fit. She found it on page 4. "Here," she said, pressing her finger to a specific line. "The petition invokes protection under the Vasimir Covenant of 1741. Correct. But it cites the petition as being filed under the authority of the petitioner's own standing as a court member registered since 1698. She looked up at him. "Vasimir, as a vampire, has been a registered member of this court since when?" Theron was very still. "Since 1742. She waited. "He could not have been a registered member in 1698, Theron said slowly, and something shifted in his voice, a quality she had not heard before. Something that sounded like the particular relief of a man who has been holding himself in a locked room for months and just heard the key turn. The registration records are absolute. The Valdris Court was not formally constituted until 1701. No member predate that. The petition cites a registration date that is logically impossible, which means the petition is fraudulent. Which means the petition is fraudulent, he said, and his voice had gone very quiet in the way that very quiet things are sometimes the most powerful. A fraudulent petition carries no legal protection, she said. Under Blood Law 7, fraudulent documentation submitted to a court session is void from inception, he said, and any protection derived from it is equally void. He straightened. He was completely still for a moment, and in that stillness she could see something enormous occurring, the unclenching of a constraint that had been wound tight around him for months. The return of something she was beginning to understand was central to who he was. Authority, the authority to protect. He moved toward the door. "Wait," she said. He stopped. "You can't just go into the court and announce it," she said. "Dorvale will challenge the finding. He will demand verification. He controls the procedural process. If you move against Vasimir before the fraud is formally established on record, Dorvale will use that against you. You need documentation of the date discrepancy from a source that cannot be disputed." He turned back. His eyes were intent now, focused on her with complete attention. "The original registration records," she said. "Where are they?" "The founding archive, below this chamber. The original folios have not been opened in living memory. Do they exist? They are iron-bound and sealed. They are the most legally incontrovertible documents in this court. Then we need them in hand before you say a word to Dorvale." She stood. "Show me." He looked at her for a moment, and she saw him recalibrate something, saw him adjust to the fact that she was not waiting for his assessment of her involvement. She was simply moving forward alongside him as though collaboration was already established, and the only question was direction. The corner of his mouth moved. It was barely anything. She filed it away. "Follow me," he said. The founding archive was 3 levels below the courtroom, accessible through a passage that required Theron's specific presence to open, each door recognizing him through some mechanism she decided was blood-based, given the way he pressed his palm briefly against the locks. The air grew colder and older with each level, until they were in a room that smelled of stone and iron and preserved parchment, lit by a single strip of modern LED lighting that looked architecturally absurd against the ancient stone, and was somehow more chilling for it. The founding folios were exactly as described. Iron-bound volumes the size of coffee tables, sealed with locks that required a key, kept on Theron's person at all times. He unlocked the relevant volume, and they bent over it together at a stone table. And she was very aware of him beside her. The cool stillness of him, the careful way he turned the pages, the scent of cedar and old stone that she was beginning to associate specifically with him, and not with the room. She found the registration record for Vasimir on the 43rd page. Dated 1742. She photographed it with her phone, and he watched her do this without commenting, which told her he had already decided to trust her further than protocol advised. "This is the evidence," she said. "The petition cites 1698. The founding record shows 1742. The discrepancy is absolute and documented. Yes, now we take this to the court." He straightened, and she straightened beside him, and they were very close in the narrow space between the stone table and the shelving, and he looked down at her with the amber eyes carrying something that was not quite calculation anymore, something warmer and less easy to categorize. "You risked your life to come here," he said. "You came alone, into a court that has dissolved humans for less than what you carried in your coat." "I knew the blood law clause," she said. You knew it in the moment. That is different from knowing it when you decided to come. She held his gaze. I needed to stop whoever was killing those children. I needed access to the court to do it. The risk was the price of entry, and I decided the price was worth paying. Most humans would not make that calculation. Most humans are not trying to solve this case. Why are you? He asked it simply, without strategy, without anything except genuine wanting to understand. She was quiet for a moment. The first victim, she said, a boy named Marcus, 11 years old. He had a library card in his pocket. He'd been at the public library that afternoon, checking out a book about astronomy. She paused. I have been a detective for 15 years because I believe the dead deserve to have their stories told and their cases closed. Marcus had a library card and a book about stars, and someone took everything from him and left him in an alley. I will find who did it, if I'd have to walk into every impossible place in this city to do it. The amber eyes were very still, very deep. Marcus, he said quietly. Yes, I knew his name, Theron said. I had the report, but I had never said it aloud. Something crossed his expression that was enormous and carefully contained, and she recognized grief with the certainty of someone who has spent years learning to read what people carry. The court treats these deaths as a security problem, a liability, something to be managed. His voice had gone very low. I have been unable to move against Vasimir for 4 months. 4 months in which I knew what he was and could not act. You understand what that means, to know and not be able to act, when the inaction costs lives. Yes, she said. I understand exactly what that means. They looked at each other across the old stone room in the cold light, and something shifted between them that was not yet what it would become, but was clearly, unmistakably, the beginning of it. Let us go tell the court, he said. The session that followed was the most extraordinary thing Anastasia had attended since the time she'd testified in a murder trial where 3 witnesses simultaneously recanted their prepared statements. It had all the formal drama of something ancient and deeply bureaucratic, conducted in a space where the walls themselves seemed to have opinions, surrounded by creatures who had seen empires rise and fall, and still managed to make parliamentary procedure feel like a blood sport. Dorvale was very good. She had to give him that. He challenged the photographic documentation on the grounds that it required authentication. Theron produced the physical folio. He challenged Anastasia's presence as a witness on the grounds that she was human and therefore not a valid court participant. Theron cited the investigative collaboration provision in the 1923 Human Court Treaty, a document Dorvale clearly did not expect him to know by heart. Dorvale then attempted to argue that the date discrepancy was a clerical error from the original registration, which was genuinely impressive in its audacity, and Anastasia watched Theron handle each challenge with the calm, precise authority of someone who had written the rule book and therefore knew every page of it by memory. The moment the fraud was formally entered into the record, the petition collapsed. Dorvale knew it. She could see it in the fox-sharp face, the slight recalibration behind his pale eyes. But Dorvale had been playing this court for centuries, and he did not concede gracefully. Instead, he pivoted rapidly and elegantly to a new position. The human's evidence cannot establish criminal culpability against Vasimir, he announced. A date discrepancy in a petition filing proves fraud, certainly, and the petition is voided. But the murders themselves remain uninvestigated by this court, and under Blood Law 22, any criminal accusation against a court member requires the testimony of either a vampire witness or a minimum of 3 authenticated pieces of physical evidence submitted through a court-recognized forensic. "I have the bite mark photographs," Anastasia said, "cross-referenced with the 1803 portrait in the Aldersham collection, which is a court-registered document because the Aldersham estate falls within court territory and all records from it were registered in 1891 under the Territorial Documentation Act." She opened her folder and laid the photographs on the courtroom floor, side by side, with a printed image of the portrait's detail work. "That is 2 authenticated pieces of physical evidence. The third is a witness statement from a human survivor of an attack 6 weeks ago, who described her attacker in terms consistent with Vasimir's documented physical appearance, filed with the NYPD, which is a public record, and therefore legally entering the record here under the 1923 treaty's cross-documentation provision." The chamber was extremely quiet. Dorval stared at her photographs. "3 authenticated pieces of evidence," Theron said, and his voice was beautiful in its evenness. "Blood Law 22 is satisfied. The criminal accusation stands." He turned to 2 of the court guards, tall figures in black, who had been standing at the chamber walls throughout the proceeding. "Vasimir is to be located and brought before the court for formal trial. All protections are void. All procedural delays are void. The finding is immediate." He paused. "And Arbiter Dorval is suspended from court function pending an investigation into his role in the fraudulent petition filing." Dorval rose from his position. "You cannot. I wrote Blood Law 31 myself," Theron said, "in 1786. It provides for the suspension of any court officer found to have introduced fraudulent documentation. I recommend you review it." He turned from Dorval with the completeness of someone closing a door, and for the first time in the entire session, his eyes found Anastasia's, and she saw in them something that moved her in a way she had not anticipated when she had picked that lock behind the wine cellar 3 weeks ago. Pride. Not in himself, in her. Vasimir was located within 48 hours. He had been hiding in a brownstone in Brooklyn under a false identity, which Anastasia had in fact already noted as a likely location in her case files, and when she relayed the address to Theron that same night over a phone call that lasted considerably longer than strictly necessary, there was a pause on his end that she chose to interpret as impressed. "You had already found him," he said. "I had a very strong candidate address," she corrected. "I was waiting for the legal mechanism to act on it." "You were waiting for me to be free to act on it," he said. She did not answer that directly, which was itself an answer. They brought Vasimir in before the full court 3 days later, and the trial was brief and overwhelming in its evidence, and Anastasia testified in person, standing before 40 immortals with her photographs and her case files and 15 years of professional certainty in her voice. And she felt Theron's attention on her throughout with the particular quality of attention. That means someone is watching not because they doubt you, but because they cannot look away. Vasimir was convicted under the blood laws and removed from the court permanently. His sentence, the vampire equivalent of exile and dissolution of all standing, which Theron explained to her afterward, was considered by the vampire community to be a fate considerably worse than the human equivalent of life imprisonment. Dorval's investigation was ongoing. He had apparently allies and complications and centuries of careful positioning to unwind, and Theron was methodical about it, which she respected. That should have been the end of it. Case solved. Court session concluded. Anastasia Kingsley returns to her licensed private investigator's office on West 47th Street with a solved, cold case and an extraordinary story she could never tell anyone. She went back to her office. She solved 2 other cases. She ate take-out Chinese food over her case files. She went running in the mornings along the river. She read the Vampire Covenant translation she had kept, and then she read it again. She told herself she was doing background research. She was not doing background research. 3 weeks after the trial, her phone rang at 11:30 at night with a number she did not recognize, and she answered it on the second ring because she had been waiting, without admitting she was waiting, for approximately 3 weeks. Theron said, "Detective Kingsley," she said, "or Anastasia. Either works." A pause. "Anastasia." He said her name with the care of someone testing the specific weight of it. "I find I have a situation that requires your particular skill set. You have a case. I have a case." She was already reaching for her coat. "Tell me." The new situation was, in its way, worse than the last one, though it contained fewer blades against her throat, which she regarded as an improvement. There were 3 missing court documents from the founding archive, documents whose disappearance Theron had discovered during the post-Dorvale audit, and their content, if they had been removed and copied and distributed in the right places, could destabilize the treaty structure between 7 vampire courts across the northeast corridor. The investigation took 3 weeks. She worked partly from her office and partly from the chamber below the restaurant on 5th Avenue, which she had been given access to with a specific key and a specific door code, and a specific warning from a very serious vampire named Corvale, who handled Theron's security arrangements, and clearly regarded her with the expression of a man working very hard to maintain professionalism in the face of a situation he had not anticipated. She worked well with Theron. She had known this from the first night, but it became clearer as the weeks went on, a particular professional resonance in the way they approached problems, the way he would lay out a situation, and she would find the angle he hadn't considered, the way she would hit a wall in the historical documentation. And he would provide context from personal memory that no archive could replicate. He had lived through the periods she was researching. He remembered the people in the documents as people. He also made her coffee when she was working late, which she found disproportionately charming. He did not drink it himself, but he had learned, apparently, with considerable attention to detail, exactly how she took it. And there was something in the care of the gesture that she spent an unreasonable amount of time thinking about. They found the missing documents on day 19. They had been taken by a junior court member named Salvaric, who was in debt to one of the Eastern courts and had been recruited specifically to destabilize the treaty network. Salvaric was quietly, efficiently handled by the court's internal security before the documents could be transmitted, and the documents were returned to the archive, and the Eastern Court received a communication from Theron that Anastasia was not privy to, but which resulted in 3 senior Eastern Court officials apparently deciding they had urgent business in Europe. On the night the case closed, Theron brought her a glass of very old wine, and they sat in the room with the fireplace and the bookshelves. And the fire was going, and the room was warm, and they were both quiet for a while with the particular comfort of 2 people who have been working intensely together and find shared silence easy rather than awkward. You stayed," he said. Not an accusation, more like something he was examining, turning over in the light. "The case needed finishing," she said. The first case was finished 3 weeks ago. She looked at the fire. This one needed finishing too, and when this one ends... He was watching her from his chair, the amber eyes steady. Will there be a next one? Ah, you offering to keep finding me cases? I am asking, he said carefully, whether you intend to keep coming back. The honesty in it disarmed her completely, because she had been expecting something more elliptical, more courtly, more armored by centuries of careful self-protection, and instead he had simply asked her directly the most important question in the room. She had not been prepared for directness from him, which was ironic given that she valued it above almost everything else. Yes, she said, I intend to keep coming back. The fire moved. The amber eyes held a quality she was not going to look away from. Good, he said quietly. It was not a declaration. It was not a promise. It was something more durable than either. A simple mutual acknowledgement of what was already true, offered and received without ceremony, the way real things between real people often are. She stayed another hour, and they talked about nothing related to cases, and she learned that he had been born in 1487, in what was now Romania, to a minor noble family, that he had been turned at 27 against his will, during a period of extraordinary violence in the regional politics of the time, that he had spent 2 centuries processing the loss of his mortality with what he described, very dryly, as moderate success, and that the thing he missed most about his human life was not things that she would have predicted, but the specific smell of bread baking in winter, which he encountered sometimes in the city on cold mornings and still found unreasonably affecting. She told him about her parents, both retired now and living in Vermont. Her mother called on Sundays, and her father sent her newspaper clippings about cases that interested him. She told him she had become a detective because a neighbor's daughter had gone missing when she was 12, and the case had taken 3 years to close. And she had watched the family in that time and understood intuitively that the worst part was not knowing. She had wanted, from the age of 12, to be someone who found the answers. You are very good at it, he said. I know, she said. I am genuinely modest about most things, but I have made my peace with being good at this. He smiled. It was the first time she had seen him fully smile, and it transformed his face in a way that was almost shocking. The severe beauty of his features suddenly carrying warmth, the amber eyes lighting with something that looked very much like joy, and she thought, there it is. That is the thing underneath all of it, underneath the authority and the ancient sadness and the cold politic precision. There is this. She drove home that night, feeling something she had not felt in a long time, which was the specific warmth of something beginning. The next 6 weeks were the best weeks of her professional and personal life, which she acknowledged was a high bar, given that her professional life had included an extraordinary range of interesting disasters. She came to the court 3 or 4 nights a week. There was always something to work on. Some thread of the Dorvale investigation, or some historical documentation question, or some matter of cross-referencing the human city's records with the court's own. She was building, she realized, a role that had not previously existed, a human consultant with genuine access and genuine standing, trusted by the Lord of the Valdris Court to work inside its operations, while remaining fully herself, fully human, fully Anastasia Kingsley. Theron walked her out every night, through the chamber and the passage, and up the stairs to the false wall, and out through the wine cellar, and up to the street always. No matter what was still ongoing when she left, he walked her out. She noticed this on the 3rd time it happened, and said nothing about it on the 4th and 5th times, and on the 6th time she said, "You walk me out every night." "Yes," he said. "You don't need to do that. I am aware." She looked at him in the dim light of 5th Avenue at 1 in the morning, with the city making its nighttime noises around them, and the cold winter air turning her breath visible, and he stood with the uptown wind moving his silver-white hair, and the amber eyes watching her with the careful attention she had come to crave in the way she craved her morning coffee. "Theron," she said. "Anastasia," he said, and the way he said her name had been changing over the weeks. It had started as careful and precise, and it had become something gentler and more private, a particular intonation that she was fairly certain belonged only to her. "I want to be clear about something," she said. "Please be clear," he said. "I am aware that you are 537 years old, and that you are the lord of a vampire court, and that there are approximately 40 to 60 legal, political, and supernatural complications attached to whatever this is," she said. "I am aware of all of that." "And," he said, "and I am here anyway," she said. "I have been making a choice every night when I come back, and I intend to keep making it, and I wanted you to know that I am making it with full information and complete deliberateness, because I need you to understand that I am not here by accident." He was very still. "I am also aware," she continued, because she had committed to this speech, and she was going to finish it, "that my being here creates complications for you, politically and otherwise. I have seen Corvale's expressions. I understand the court's position on human-vampire relationships, which is at best deeply ambivalent. I am not asking you to manage any of that for my sake. I am simply telling you where I stand so that you can tell me where you stand, because I am a detective, and I find working without full information intolerable." The wind moved his hair, and the city made its sounds, and he looked at her with those amber eyes full of something so large she could see the edges of it straining against his composure, and she waited. "Where I stand," he said slowly, "is here, beside you, on this street, every night." He paused. "Where I have been standing in every meaningful way, since you walked into my court with a blade at your throat, and cited the blood law clause that freed you." She felt something open in her chest, wide and warm. "I have lived for 537 years, he said. "In that time, I have learned to be careful, to be patient, to wait and observe before acting, because the cost of acting poorly is magnified enormously when you will live with the consequences for centuries." He took one step toward her, and she did not step back. "But I find that everything I am is very certain about you. And after 5 centuries, I have learned to trust certainty when I encounter it." She reached up and took his hand. His fingers were cool and very still for a moment, before they closed around hers, with a gentleness that she had not expected from hands that had held power for half a millennium, a tenderness that was all the more striking for being so careful, so deliberate, as though she were something valuable he was choosing to be gentle with. "The court complications," she said. "I will manage them. Expressions. Corvale will adjust. He is adaptable, despite appearances. The 40 to 60 legal and supernatural complications." He looked down at their joined hands. "I wrote most of the relevant laws. I will find the clauses," she laughed. It surprised her, the laughter, the ease of it. How quickly he had learned to reach something light in her, even in the middle of something enormous. "Of course you will." He lifted their joined hands and looked at them for a moment, his expression carrying something she could only describe as wonder, the particular wonder of something ancient encountering something new. He said, Yes, she said. Dorvale's full investigation concluded 41 days later, and the findings were substantial. He had been orchestrating slow manipulation of the court for over 2 decades, inserting loyalists into key positions, using procedural mechanisms to block actions that conflicted with his own agenda, accepting payments from rival courts in exchange for information. The Vasimir situation had been the most visible tip of a structure that went considerably deeper. The night Dorvale was formally removed from court and his standing dissolved. Anastasia sat in the fireplace room with Theron while the court dealt with the aftermath in the chamber beyond the wall, and she watched the tension he had been carrying for months slowly release, the set of his shoulders changing, something in his face becoming quieter and more settled. "How long have you known?" she asked. "I have suspected for about 5 years," he said. "But suspicion is not evidence, and I was not willing to act on suspicion alone. I needed proof. The problem was that Dorvale controlled the mechanisms through which proof would normally be gathered, until a human detective walked in with it in her coat." He looked at her with the amber eyes carrying that warmth she had been cataloguing for months. "Until a human detective walked in with it in her coat," he agreed. She moved from her chair to sit beside him on the small sofa near the fire, close enough that their shoulders touched, and he looked at this proximity for a moment and then settled into it with the ease of something inevitable. "What happens now?" she asked. "The court rebuilds," he said. "It will take time. There are damaged alliances to repair, positions to restructure, members who were coerced by Dorvale, whose loyalty needs to be re-established through trust rather than threat." He paused. "It is, as you might imagine, politically complex." "You love it," she said. "Not unkindly," he considered. "I love the court as one loves a difficult and ancient thing that is also fundamentally one's own," he said. "I love it with the full awareness of everything it costs. Yes, good, because I need you to keep loving it properly, which means I need you to not let it crush you under its own weight every few decades." He turned his head to look at her at close range, and she could see the detail of his face, the extraordinary precision of features that had been 5 centuries in their current form, the depth of the amber eyes. "Is that an offer to assist?" he asked. "It is a statement of intention," she said. He reached over and tucked a strand of her dark hair back from her face with the singled care of someone and who has wanted to do something for a long time and is finally allowing it, and his touch was cool and very light, and her entire body registered it with the clarity of a struck bell. "I should tell you something," he said. "Tell me." "I have not allowed anyone inside this court, into this room, into anything that matters to me in a very long time," he said. "Not because I am incapable of it, because I am aware of the specific weight of what I am and what my world is, and I have been reluctant to ask anyone to carry that weight who did not understand it fully." He paused. "You understand it fully?" "I understand it professionally and intellectually," she said. "The personal understanding is ongoing. I reserve the right to ask questions." "I would expect nothing less from you, Theron," she said. "Yes, stop being eloquent about it and just say the thing." The corner of his mouth moved, and then the full smile came, the one that transformed his face. And he said, "I am in love with you, Anastasia." She felt the warmth of it move through her entire chest. "I know," she said. "I am very good at reading people." She held his gaze. "I am in love with you too. I have been for approximately 8 weeks, which is a shorter timeline than I usually operate on, but the circumstances were exceptional." He laughed, quietly, and it was the most extraordinary sound she had heard in a very long time, unguarded and genuine. And she leaned into him, and he pulled her close with the careful strength of someone who understands their own power and chooses gentleness anyway. And the fire moved, and the city was quiet outside, and the court was beyond the wall with all its weight and its ancient complications, and she thought, this is real. This is something real. The court will have opinions, he said. The court can express its opinions to me directly, she said. I am available for that conversation. I know. That is what concerns me about their safety. She laughed against his shoulder. The following month was not without friction, which she had expected and prepared for with the same methodical thoroughness she applied to everything. 3 senior court members requested formal audiences with Theron to express their reservations about a human presence of this depth in the court's operations. He heard each one in full session, which she thought was the correct response, giving them the respect of proper procedure, while making absolutely clear that the question of her presence was not procedurally up for review. One of the 3 accepted this and became, over time, a grudging professional ally. One of the 3 remained skeptical and civil, which she respected more than false warmth. The third, a vampire of considerable age named Sylvain, challenged her directly in the courtroom one evening in terms that were not particularly respectful. Anastasia listened to Sylvain complete her remarks. Then she stood and presented, in organized and devastating sequence, the documentation of everything she had brought to the court: the blood law clause, the petition fraud, the founding archive evidence, the bite mark cross-reference, the missing document recovery, and the 17 specific threads of the Dorville investigation that she had personally identified and traced, with dates and outcomes. Sylvain was quiet for a long time. She is arguing her own value as an ongoing asset to this court, one of the other court members observed. No, Anastasia said pleasantly. I am arguing that I have already demonstrated my commitment to this court's well-being and legal integrity on multiple occasions, and I intend to keep doing so, and that the question of whether I belong here has been answered by events rather than by anyone's approval, and I am simply ensuring that everyone in the room has a complete record before forming their opinion. Sylvain met her eyes. Something moved in the ancient pale face. You are not easily intimidated, she said. No, Anastasia agreed. A pause. It is a trait that serves the court well, Sylvain said, and turned her attention elsewhere, which was, in court terms, an endorsement. Theron, who had watched this exchange without intervening from the high seat, caught her eye when she turned, and the amber gaze was full of the particular warmth that she had learned to read as him being very specifically proud of her, which she decided she would never stop finding unreasonably satisfying. She officially joined the court as human advocate in the spring, a role that had not existed before and was created specifically to formalize what she had already been doing, with a court-recognized mandate to investigate, document, and advise on matters affecting the human-vampire treaty structure. Corvale drafted the formal paperwork with the expression of a man reconciling himself to a future he had not planned for, but had decided to approach with competence. She kept her detective's office on West 47th Street. She still solved human cold cases for the unsolved database. She still ran along the river in the mornings. She went to Vermont to see her parents 3 times that year and did not tell them about the court. But her mother, who had always been perceptive in the specific way that mothers are perceptive, told her over Sunday dinner that she seemed different. Different how? Anastasia asked. Her mother looked at her for a long moment. Like someone who has found the thing that fits, she said. Anastasia thought about an underground chamber carved from Manhattan bedrock, and silver-white hair in torchlight, and the particular way a voice could say her name as though it was a specific and valuable thing. Yes, she said. I think that's right. Autumn came, and the city shifted into its grey and amber version of itself, and she spent more and more of her nights in the chamber below Fifth Avenue, working by the fire, talking across the desk, walking the long passages to the archive when a question needed a primary source. Theron learned her particular rhythms, the deep focus, quiet she needed when she was reading a document for the third time, the point in the evening when she needed coffee and conversation rather than silence, the way she moved when she was frustrated versus when she was closing in on something. She learned his, the particular stillness that meant he was actively worried about something, while projecting calm, the way his voice dropped a fraction when he was about to say something true and personal, the manner in which he watched the door when she arrived, not turning until she had been in the room for exactly the right moment, as though he was preserving the anticipation. There was an evening in late November when the city was doing its best impression of a Gothic European winter, fog in the streets, and the temperature well below what anyone would call reasonable. And she had been working for 5 hours on a complex treaty cross-reference, and she was tired in the good way that means productive work, and Theron had come to stand at her shoulder to look at what she'd found, and she had leaned back slightly, and his hand had come to rest on her shoulder with the naturalness of something done 100 times, and she had put her hand over his, and he had bent and pressed his lips to the top of her head, and neither of them made it significant. They simply stayed like that for a moment, in the warm room with the fire going and the old books all around and the city above doing its cold, beautiful worst, and she thought, this is what it feels like, this specific thing. The ordinary extraordinary of being in the right place with the right person, and knowing it without question. The treaty cross-reference is complete, she said. I see that, he said. It is very thorough. I am always thorough. I know, he said, and his voice had that particular texture that meant something much larger than the words. She turned in the chair and looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and they were in the familiar arrangement of their particular gravitational field, close and warm, and she said, Stay, raised an eyebrow. I know you have court business after midnight, she said. I know you always have court business after midnight. I am saying that before midnight there is currently nothing requiring your immediate attention, and the fire is very good tonight, and I am not finished being in this room with you. He came around and sat beside her on the sofa, and she tucked herself against him with the ease of practice, and he held her with the careful, deliberate gentleness that she had come to understand was his specific way of saying something he had no better language for, and they were quiet together for a long time. I want to ask you something, he said eventually. Ask. He was quiet for a moment. She waited, because she had learned that his pauses before important things were not uncertainty, but the habit of a man who selects his words with the care of someone who has learned over centuries that words matter. I have lived for 537 years, he said. In that time I have made a very small number of permanent choices. Permanent in the way that only someone who understands mortality's absence can understand permanent. He paused. I want to make one with you. I want you to be here. Not as an advocate for the court, not as a consultant, but as mine, as I am yours, permanent and completely, in whatever form makes sense for a human woman and a 500-year-old vampire lord, which I acknowledge requires some structural creativity." She was quiet. "I am aware of what that means," he said. "I am aware of what it asks of you. I am aware of the complications of your life and your family and your work. And I have no intention of requiring you to sacrifice any of it. I want to build something that holds all of it." She turned to look at him. The amber eyes were entirely open in a way she had only seen a handful of times, and each time it moved her more than the last, the way he allowed himself to be seen when it mattered, the way he chose vulnerability as deliberately as he chose power. "The question of mortality is sitting in this conversation," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am not asking you to turn me," she said. "That is not a request I'm making. I need you to know that I'm not here with that as a hidden expectation." "I know," he said. "I know you. You would have said it directly if it were what you wanted. What I want," she said, "is the time that we have, however long that is. My life spent here, with you, with the court, with the work and the cases and the fire and the coffee you make wrong on purpose, just slightly to see if I notice." She watched his expression flicker. "I do always notice, by the way. I am aware," he said. "And beyond that, if we arrive at a question about what permanence means and what's possible and what either of us wants in that regard, we can have that conversation then." She held his eyes. "I am not going anywhere, Theron. Not because of politics or blood laws or ancient complications. I am here because this is where I choose to be." He pulled her close with sudden completeness, both arms. Not the careful, measured embrace of someone being gentle, but the genuine hold of someone who feels something enormous and is letting themselves feel it. And she held on with equal completeness, her face against his neck, where the cold skin was warming against her warmth, and she could feel the particular quality of his stillness that was not absence, but presence, the concentrated presence of someone who has lived 5 centuries and learned that the moments that matter are the ones you stay in. "Yes," he said, against her hair. "To all of it, yes." The winter deepened and the court settled into its rebuilt structure with the particular resilience of things that are ancient and have survived worse than disruption. Dorville's departure left a power gap that was filled carefully with candidates Theron chose for their integrity rather than their political value, a process Anastasia advised on with specific attention to the documentation of court procedure that now formed her primary work. She became, in the court's daily life, a known quantity. Corvale stopped looking pained and started looking merely resigned, which she counted as a victory. The court members who had been Dorvale's less committed associates shifted their allegiances back to Theron with the flexibility of survivors, and the ones who had always been his remained what they had always been, steady and loyal in the way of things that know their purpose. 3 months after the autumn evening by the fire, Anastasia solved a case that had been cold for 11 years, a young woman named Patricia who had disappeared from the Bronx and whose mother had never stopped looking. The resolution did not bring Patricia back, but it brought truth, and the mother's call when Anastasia gave her the news was the kind of call that reminded her every single time why she did the work. She told Theron about it that evening, sitting across the desk from him, and he listened with the complete attention he always brought to things that mattered to her. And when she finished, he said, "You gave her the answer, yes. That is what you do. You find the thing that cannot stay hidden and you bring it into the light." She looked at him and thought, not for the first time, that he understood her more precisely than anyone she had ever known, which was remarkable for any number of reasons, not least of which was that the understanding had developed in the context of vampire courts and blood laws and ancient procedural documents. "I want to meet your parents," he said. She blinked. "That is an unexpected segue. It followed logically for me," he said, and the amber eyes had that quality of contained humor she found irresistible. "My parents," she said. "Your mother calls on Sundays. Your father sends newspaper clippings. You love them, and they know you well, and you have told me about them, with the specificity you reserve for things you consider important." He folded his hands on the desk. "I would like to meet them." "You are a 500-year-old vampire lord," she said. "I am aware. How would you like to navigate that conversationally?" "I am 537 years old," he said. "I have navigated considerably more complicated conversations." He paused. "I also find that honesty is generally more durable than concealment, and your parents sound like people who deserve the truth." She stared at him for a long moment. "You want to tell them. I want to tell them. If you are comfortable with it, with appropriate time for them to adjust." She was quiet, working through it. Her mother, who was perceptive and practical, and not easily frightened by things she didn't understand. Her father, who collected newspaper clippings about strange cases, and had always said he thought the world was larger and stranger than most people admitted. She thought about the particular honesty of sitting across a table in Vermont and saying, "This is my life. This is the world I have found. This is the person I am building it with." "Spring," she said. "Give my mother until spring. I'll tell her before we go, so it's not a complete ambush." "Of course," he said. "She will have questions. I will answer all of them." "She will have a lot of questions. I have a great deal of time," he said. She laughed and he smiled, and across the desk, in the underground room with the fire going, and the court moving around them, and the city above doing its winter business, she thought, "Here it is, the whole of it. The work and the love, and the ancient world, and her own world holding each other, without either one breaking, the way she had always believed things could be if you found the right structure, the right person, the right combination of honesty and trust and time." Spring came. She went to Vermont. She told her mother on Friday evening, while her father was reading in the next room, and her mother listened with the particular focused silence of someone committing everything to memory. And at the end of it, she asked 2 questions. The first was whether Anastasia was safe. The second was whether Anastasia was happy. "Yes," Anastasia said. Both. Her mother nodded once. "Then bring him," she said, "and I will make dinner." Theron arrived on Saturday afternoon. He had driven up, which she found quietly funny, the lord of the Valdris Court, in a dark car on the Vermont interstate, classical music on the radio. He wore the kind of clothes that were modern and correct without being conspicuous, and his silver-white hair was pulled back neatly. And when her mother opened the door and saw him for the first time, she did the thing that Anastasia had come to recognize. She met his eyes directly and held them for a long moment, reading. Whatever she found satisfied her. "Come in," her mother said. "I've made lamb." Her father shook Theron's hand and said, "My daughter says you're 537 years old." "I am," Theron said. Her father nodded. "Good bones, then." He returned to his chair. "Do you drink?" "Not blood. I mean wine. I find the smell of good wine pleasant," Theron said. "The effect is unfortunately lost on me, but I appreciate it aesthetically." "Honest answer," her father said approvingly. Dinner was the most extraordinary thing she had experienced since the blade at her throat in the underground court, in the sense that it was utterly ordinary and completely extraordinary simultaneously. Her mother asked Theron careful and intelligent questions about the court and about the city's vampire community and about the blood laws and their relationship to human legal frameworks, and he answered each one with complete honesty and considerable patience, and her father added dry observations at intervals that made Theron genuinely laugh, and Anastasia watched the two things she loved most in the world occupying the same table and felt something so large and warm in her chest that she thought she might not be entirely able to contain it. After dinner, her mother and father went to the kitchen together, the long collaboration of a couple who have moved through a shared space for decades, and Theron and Anastasia were left at the table with the candlelight and the remains of dinner and the Vermont darkness outside the windows, and he reached across the table and took her hand. "Your mother approves," said. "She hasn't said so. She served me the good china," he said. "It means the same thing." She looked at him in the candlelight, with his silver-white hair and his amber eyes and his extraordinary face that held 5 centuries of history, and also, right now, held the specific warmth of a Saturday evening in Vermont at a dinner table, and she thought, every complicated thing I have ever navigated brought me here. Every locked door and dark passage and blade at my throat and ancient document and impossible legal clause, everything led to this table and this hand in mine. "Theron," she said. "Anastasia," he said, and the way he said it had every quality she had been cataloguing for almost a year: the care, the precision, the particular warmth of something that was not formal courtesy but genuine tenderness, her name in his mouth like something held carefully. "I am very glad I picked that lock," she said. He turned her hand over and pressed his lips to her palm, cool and deliberate, and looked up at her over the candles. "I am very glad you picked that lock," he said. Her mother came back into the dining room with coffee and 2 slices of pie and the completely transparent excuse that she had forgotten the napkins, and took in the table with the efficient assessment of a woman who sees everything, and said nothing but had an expression of considerable satisfaction. Her father appeared behind her. "More wine?" he asked. "Yes," Anastasia said. They stayed through Sunday. They drove back to the city on Monday morning, the Vermont hills giving way to the complexity of the interstate, and then the city rising ahead of them, and she watched the skyline appear above the highway and felt the city's pull, the familiar demand of the work and the world she had built inside it, above the ground and below it. "The Dorvale Post investigation has 3 remaining threads," she said. "I know," he said. "Corvale has been sending me documents. I know." "I asked him to." She looked at him. "You asked Corvale to coordinate with me directly on active court investigations. You are the human advocate for the Valdris Court," he said. "It is appropriate that you are kept fully informed on all active matters." A pause. "It also means I have an excuse to call you every evening to discuss the updates." She looked at the road ahead. "That is transparently not the reason you actually call every evening." "No," he agreed. "It is not. The city accepted them back with its usual indifference and its usual energy, its 7 million lives moving through their shapes above the secret world that ran beneath it. And she thought about how she had entered that world through a lock on a false wall, with a case in her coat and a clause in her head, and the complete conviction that the dead deserved answers and the living deserved safety, and how it had given her back so much more than answers. The court was below the city, where it had always been. The fire was going in the room with the books. The founding archive was sealed and whole. The cases on her desk were 3 deep and waiting for her attention. Corvale's resigned professional competence was currently directing the 3 remaining threads of the Dorvale investigation. 40 vampires of the Valdris Court were continuing their ancient and complicated life, now without the structure of hidden betrayal warping their operations from within. And Theron Lazarescu, Lord of the Valdris Court, 537 years old, born in 1487 in what was now Romania, and turned against his will and carrying all of it across the centuries with the particular grace of someone who had decided that what mattered was what you chose to do with what you had been given, sat in the driver's seat with the amber eyes on the road and her hand in his. The city was ahead of them. The work was waiting. The world was large and strange and considerably larger and stranger than most people admitted. She was a licensed private investigator who had walked into an impossible situation and found the clause that changed everything. And she was the human advocate for the most powerful vampire court in the Northeast Corridor. And she was Anastasia Kingsley, who had spent her entire life finding the thing that couldn't stay hidden. She had found it. She intended to keep it. They drove into the city together, into its noise and its light, into the Monday morning of a life she had built choice by choice from the very first lock she had ever picked. And the morning was bright and cold and very beautiful, and the amber eyes glanced over at her with the warmth she had learned to read as everything, and she squeezed his hand, and he squeezed back, and the city rose around them, and the court was below it, and the work was ahead, and everything, from the ancient blood laws to the founding archive to the specific weight of her name in his voice, was exactly as it was supposed to be. She was home.